So, please.
Pascal. Yes, to be short on that, if we do not do that theme now, there will be no other occasion to do it. So it's an historic moment to speak about that defense structure, this own defense structure in Europe. We should integrate it into that discussion about the European Union and the conference of the future of that European Union. And I hope that will be the case. You know, I'm now in that conference since month, and things were not so well organized that I had the impression that we will come out with a treaty change at the end of that process. Perhaps now that historic moment will lead to that. I hope so, but I'm not sure that it will be, but we have to work on it.
Thanks a lot. Martin Klatt, we in the Netherlands, we do not hear a lot about Denmark. Perhaps you have the more first-hand side. There is a debate also about, of course, integration of Denmark also more into defense policy of the European Union. What is that exactly
about?
Denmark
has this opt-out in the joint defense policy, and the government has announced that there will be a vote on 1st of June to join, actually, and it will be interesting to see, because these votes tend to be like Brexit. They tend to be 48-52, something like this. So it will be interesting to see whether the Danish government will be able to leave this opt-out and join the European joint defense policies. On what also remarkable, I mean, we talk a lot about Poland hosting refugees. What is also remarkable that Denmark is hosting refugees. I mean, Denmark being one of the countries that in 2015 put up a lot of barriers and confiscation of jewelry laws and things like this for refugees entering. So there is also a paradigm change there.
And can you just explain, Denmark is member to NATO, but why were they so hesitant also at the European Union level?
Good question. I mean, this was together. Well, there was the Maastricht Treaty, which was rejected by the Danish people in 1992, and then the renegotiation and the Edinburgh Treaty. I must admit, I don't exactly remember what was the precise argument why Denmark did not want to join a European defense policy, defense cooperation. But I imagine that it's no. I think it has to do with Denmark perceiving the EU, especially the pre-1992 or the pre-2000, well, the pre-2000 for extension EU, as a German-French axis, where Germany and France dominated common joint foreign policy, and Denmark tending to be rather close to the US when it comes to foreign policy. So it was kind of also showing that we prefer NATO and we do not really want something parallel to NATO. But it has, of course, become very visible that it's for the Danish armed forces, it is a big disadvantage not to be involved in European joint defense policy.
Okay, thanks a lot. So it is a heartbreak, but we will now really go into the core issue of the border regions, cross-border regions and their future. We have done 2-3 research studies during the last couple of years on, for instance, crisis management in the Eurasien-Maas-Rhine, in the COVID crisis. And I have to say, I learned a lot about governance and the question of subsidiarity in a cross-border situation, crisis management across the border. And there, I would like to present to you some results and some ideas. What is probably missing? Why was it so difficult to show more solidarity across the border in this COVID crisis? We'll just share my screen. It shows some slides. So can you see it now? Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
I will go back. So the debate that I would like to also have with you is more or less what did we see during the crisis, and now we are not really at the end of the COVID crisis, I would say. That is the hope, but I'm afraid that is not the case. So what did we see? Was it a sort of rebordering effect? Of course, we saw closed borders, but is that also something that will remain? That we, in border studies, of course, already with the migration crisis, there was the idea of a rebordering effect. Is that really now happening? Or is that more an impetus, an impulse for closer cross-border cooperation because we saw also the deficiencies during the crisis? I think that's an interesting point. And the next point is now, what about our organizations across the border? What about the broader picture of cross-border governance? Was that now how we tackled the crisis a failure also of the governance system, or was it the proof of its functioning? We have seen, for instance, I will come to that later, rather a positive role of our Euro region, Maas-Rhine, and also there the Secretariat played a very important role during the crisis. To some extent, we saw also the benefits of now this capacity building that was done during the last couple of years. And of course, with respect to the future of Europe, now, what has to be done? Do we have new instruments to strengthen also cross-border solidarity? Because that will be a bit my point, that it was very difficult to show cross-border solidarity in practice because of different reasons during this crisis. And that leads me to also a thing I thought a lot about the last couple of weeks, subsidiarity. Now, for me also, the COVID crisis showed a crisis of subsidiarity, because there were some elements handled at the wrong level, probably, handled at national level, where it would have been better at the European level or at the local and regional level. But the national level took over, and for me, that is really also a problem of subsidiarity. Now, what did we saw in our research? That cross-border solidarity was more or less hindered by three major handicaps. And in the first place, there was a crucial lack of EU harmonization. And we are, of course, aware that the health sector is not a sector that has been very much harmonized in Brussels. And there it is very interesting that if you look into agriculture policy, and I did that with respect to animal diseases, of course, it would be a chaos if every member state would invent measures. If there is for instance, a bird's flu or what have you, and the member states would have to invent their own measures with respect to a certain pandemic or epidemic situation with respect to animal diseases. That is not the case. There we have harmonized measures, and this is also up to European legislation, and the European Commission has there also some competencies. So to some extent, what we saw, that in all the member states, more or less, there were different measures with respect to different infection rates. We had problems with data, we had problems with definitions and things like that. You could say that was not by accident. It was to some extent on purpose, because that was also a result of non-harmonization in the health sector, and also a non-harmonization of a pandemic situation that was not more or less in the first place agreed upon beforehand what we do if things happen. So that it was done at the national level was, of course, due to a lack of EU harmonization. And then, of course, we saw at the national level, if you say we have no EU harmonization, that you could say, yes, then, of course, you have to have good agreements between neighbors at the national level in order to coordinate your national measures, in order to be ready to have the same data, and also to have, for instance, at the border, also a situation where you can coordinate also with respect to the timing of your measures, what you do. And that was, of course, also a surprise that apparently even between member states like the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, we haven't seen their protocols, agreements beforehand, what to do in order to coordinate crisis management. And yes, we have seen, and we have also described that very positively, for instance, the Dutch and the German governments, or I have to say the government of North Rhine-Westphalia, they were very strongly advocating that the border is not the instrument as such to fight the pandemic. And there we saw also difference between the Belgian-Dutch situation and the German-Dutch situation. But to some extent, even with a task force at the national level that was led by North Rhine-Westphalia, with Belgium and with the Netherlands, we saw that it was only possible to have some repair measures. It was even after 2 years of the crisis, it was very difficult for the national governments to, for instance, really agree on the timing of quarantine measures or the testing procedures or the travel regulations. So even there was a bit of an improvement, but even after 2 years, there were decisions made by a national government, and then more or less across the border at national level, the governments tried to avoid the most problems that were then more or less created by non-harmonization of measures. So very surprisingly that there was a lack of EU harmonization, but this was not substituted by very close agreements already by neighboring member states. And then if we look at the regional and local level, we have especially seen with respect to the coordination of hospitals and the cooperation of hospitals, that there was a big problem, for instance, in our border situation, that we had very strong networks of hospitals, Aachen, Maastricht, Liège or Hasselt. And normally these hospitals work very closely together with respect to ambulances and other things. But in the case of the pandemic, more or less, there was national steering, for instance, of the spreading patients across the country. That was also in the Netherlands done at the national level. And to some extent that prevented cross-border cooperation of hospitals with respect to intensive care units and COVID patients. So that was another effect where you could say subsidiarity there was also a bit tricky, that you could not benefit from the local regional networks that you have had already established because of a level, in this case the national level, who was then in the lead in the crisis management, for instance, with respect to sending patients to different hospitals where there were empty places. So to some extent you could say we have seen a subsidiarity problem, and normally subsidiarity is very often said, yes, it should be done at a lower level where people are closer to citizens. But I think there, in this case, we can also see there is a rather a type of paradox that for the border region, it would have been great if there have been more EU harmonization, if the EU would have more or less created more harmonized measures, that you could say there is a certain figure incidence and that leads to certain measures. That would have been wonderful for border situations, whereas a national approach was really difficult for a region like the Euregio-Maas-Rhine, where 3 member states come together. So a unexpected subsidiarity problem that has led to threats, and I think for the border and cross-border territories, there are 3 dimensions where we see that. Socioeconomic effects, and I have to say, to some extent, we can be surprised that in the first place, of course, with respect to also national assistance programs and financial assistance, the socioeconomic impact so far wasn't that bad as we expected. And there it's very often very difficult to distinguish between a cross-border effect and the effect more or less of general COVID measures. But what we see, of course, to have an integrated labor market, that was always our idea. It is, of course, for people not really attractive if they learn from the neighbor who is a cross-border worker that he has been faced for the last 2 years with a very complex and difficult situation with respect to all different types of rules. The impact on European citizenship, of course, there was damage during the first wave, also especially at the Belgian-Dutch border. If people are not allowed to see their family, you have there, of course, a big impact also on trust. What is it worth to be a European citizen if things can happen like that? And where I see also the most of the long-term effects for cross-border territories, that is more or less also the idea of cross-border cohesion and cooperation. Psychologically, is it at the moment, I think, very difficult to convince people in border regions that the border is open and will be open, and then we all live together in a wonderful cross-border region. So normally what you tell people on a Sunday speech, I think in the first place, this will be very difficult to regain trust also for the idea of our joint cross-border border region. And there is, of course, also the question with respect to our organizations. Did we see there also a failure of the governance system? Because people can say, yeah, but what about a Euro region? If it comes to closing the border, they were not able to do anything and things like that. That is not really true, because I said, in our case, for instance, the EU region did a lot, more or less helping to repair most of the problems created by non-coordination of measures. But of course, psychologically, a lot of people have the feeling, of course, that there was not much left of a EU region. Now, what were the recommendations from our point of view? Strengthening solidarity mechanisms, because we saw that it was very difficult to have this type of solidarity with respect to patients, for instance, because there was a lack of mechanisms. And that means, in the first place, we need more harmonization, probably at the European Union level. So what is a health union in the future? And are there more things that will be harmonized at EU level if it comes to a pandemic and different aspects, and probably not only now an assignment to buy vaccines, but also with respect to the link between incident rates and measures. The second is the national level. I mean, we saw there was a lack of protocols, so now it's time for the member states and especially the neighboring countries to come with new protocols, to cooperation agreements with respect to hospitals. What about spreading of patients in another crisis? We had ad hoc, for instance, people coming from, I think, also Liège to Aachen, or from the Netherlands to North Rhine-Westphalia, but that was all ad hoc. That was not a structured cooperation between hospitals, and that is certainly something that you have to do now also, and lay that down in protocols and agreements. And there is also the question of a crisis management structure, of course, at the highest level. Probably we also have to think about that, how to also establish that in a better way. And at the regional local level, as I said, there were a lot of lost opportunities probably, because the cross-border activities were sometimes overruled by national steering, And there we need also a better balance between national steering and also regional and at the local level. So we need also at the local level probably cross-border crisis management with cross-border teams, also at the political level. We need there also new protocols for the cooperation of hospitals, very practical, how we act in a situation, in a pandemic situation or in another crisis. And now some elements for the future of Europe. What could that mean if we see now, and we could describe that also as a sort of crisis in the cross-border region. What could that mean for the whole concept of the future of Europe? Of course, the Health Union, and Pascal Arimont will certainly also say something about that because he's a member to a working group on health. So strengthening the Health Union in the treaty is of course very important. What type of harmonization could be helpful? Now, what about cross-border solidarity as such? Are there elements and innovative elements that we could think of to also bring elements of cross-border solidarity into the treaty? What about free movement of persons? Do we need there also very special protection of people in border regions? Because we saw that apparently the normal 4 freedoms were not enough. And what about the subsidiarity principle? Do we need also the cross-border aspect there, that we say subsidiarity has also a horizontal element, that you have also to think about the local and regional level in a horizontal way if it goes across the border, and that you also there give some new thinking about what could that mean, subsidiarity principle, also with a horizontal cross-border element. And the last, do we also need a sort of new status for cross-border organizations? What is the future of Euro regions, Euro districts? Are there possibilities in order to also improve the legal situation? And of course, we have the EGTC and we have ideas about a cross-border mechanism, but perhaps now it's the time also to be more ambitious with respect here also to the legal instruments. So that was, in a nutshell, some ideas from our recent studies, and I hope also for you some ideas for the debate. Now I'm back again. You don't see the presentation any longer? Yeah. Okay. So perhaps I will first start with Pascal Arimont, because of course for many years you have even also with your office a sort of information center where also people can come if they have also cross-border issues. What is your idea? Do we also face a crisis of the cross-border region after the COVID, after what happened with COVID?
Difficult question and no easy answer. Closing borders was a shock for people living in that cross-border region, and we faced problems that we did not know since years, and this was for people living here a kind of exercise in order to be aware what kind of evolution such a cross-border area has known the last 30 years. We recognized how easy our daily life was actually, and how difficult it became when we fall into that time 40 years ago. And therefore, I think that people recognize that living in such a border region within the European Union without borders is an added value, and they recognized it. But the difficulties that we faced during the COVID crisis were due to, first of all, like you said, a lack of European harmonization, because the European Union does not have any competence in health matters in order to harmonize things at that level. And then it was the national level that took over and made laws and measures, created measures that were not harmonized with the neighbor. And we here at the crossroads, of the three countries, we had to face with 3 or 4 different legal situations each and every day. This was highly difficult to understand, because all the people living here are crossing the border on a daily basis, and they had to face with 3 different legal situations, and we could not change it as a cross-border structure in the Euregio-Maas-Rhine. We have no competence to make laws in that perspective. This could be one day an idea, and we should perhaps speak about that cross-border mechanism that has been proposed by the Commission, and Nathalie Verskelde knows what I'm talking about, because this is a brilliant idea to that border region, or one side of the border region could choose the applicable law on a certain situation. But we do not have that at that point. And we as politicians acting on behalf of the Euregio-Maas-Rhine, we had to explain and inform the people what's at stake. And this was highly difficult, because we had to manage those situations. Each and every situation was different, and the national level did not see those problems, because for them it was they had to take measures to protect the population of whole the country, but the consequences of those measures that were not harmonized with the neighbors, only people living on border regions near the border had to face with those consequences. And the consequences were quite hard to accept, that in one country the companies could work, in the other country not, that in one country the cafes and restaurants could open, in the other country not, that in one country you had to wear the mask, in other countries not, in one country you have to be vaccinated 3 times, in another country you had not to do it. Really difficult. And what we did, and what the Euregio-Maas-Rhine did, was to inform people. They had 2 million answers to people contacting them in order to have a question. 2 million within a year. This is huge. But, and here we have to say, the cross-border cooperation functions well in that perspective, because people from one and the other side of the border knew each other. So there was that structure in order to explain to people what's at stake, and to solve all the small problems behind the scheme. And they did it in an informal way quite often. And we managed to have that organization of the crisis, or the crisis management, in a smart way, and in a way that was in opposite to what has been decided at the national level. And I have to admit, this was a really hard time for us to know what's at stake, to know all the differences, and to explain to people why it's like that.
Yeah. And that's what I said. I mean, we saw that also our capacities, the Secretariat of the Euregio played a very important role, but more or less in repairing the problems due to non-coordination. But you talk a lot to citizens, and also, I guess, to people with companies. And so I can imagine a lot of people are very frustrated.
And the first thing they told us was, why do we have a European Union if it's allowed to close borders in such a situation? Because the national level had to react. They did not know what the virus could do to their country, and they act with the closing border. We know now that closing a border within that region where we live had no sense and had no effect. So, but at the first days of the crisis, they act like that, perhaps in the first reaction, but afterwards, they should have known that acting like that is completely deorganizing structures and the daily life of people. At the end, and in the actual situation, we still see that the national level takes measures that are not harmonized with Germany, with the Netherlands, with Luxembourg, in order to create that mosaic, that puzzle of different measures. And therefore, I plead for a kind of harmonization at the European level, that the European level should act in case of a pandemic to define, like you said, perimeters in order to define criteria, and then the lower level could act on behalf of those criteria, and the Euregio-Meuse-Rhin could act on behalf of on those criteria in a harmonized way, and not in that way that we did.
We come back also to the question of the health sector and what you do there. But first, the question to Martin Klatt. At your border, is that felt by people also as a failure of the cross-border region? Do you see that also as a scientist who has also described what is a cross-border region and what is the governance of a cross-border region as a major crisis?
Well, as a scientist, I would say it is a failure of cross-border regional governance. But when it comes to the people or the residents, we actually do not really know. I mean, I had with a colleague from Scotland, we made a little study in the summer 2020, where surprisingly we found out that about half the people who participated, well, about 40% of the people who participated in this study actually thought it was a good idea to close the border, and that the measure was exactly the thing to do. Even though we today have even then the WHO never recommended closing the borders. This was never really done on a health policy. It was a health policy background, but it was more securitization. And to me, I mean, and coming from the Danish border, where we have had these issues all the time, more or less. I mean, the Denmark joined Schengen rather late in 2001. This was rather controversial in Denmark to do it. We have had an issue with the customs control at the border in the summer of 2011, which then stopped because of a change of government. We have had the migration, where of course we have a somewhat control on all the borders if you go north all the way up to Norway. But in my experience, nobody doing it as consistently as Denmark. On the main crossings, at least, where they check everybody, and at least on the train, where everybody is checked all the time. And then we have this famous fence that was built in 2019 to like against free movement of wild boars. So this debate is much more present about closing borders, and even to Sweden, and that is probably the most aghast. I mean, when I Denmark, Germany, this is kind of okay. There is some border crossing tendencies all the time, but the Nordic Brotherhood, Sweden, and even there we have had controls before COVID because of this there was a bomb attack on a building of the tax authorities, which was committed by 2 Swedes, which was used as a reason now we have to close that border too, and destroying all this narrative of the Greater Copenhagen area, Öresund, and where you could probably came closest to what we as scientists or as activists how we like to understand a true cross-border region. So definitely. Now, on the positive side, I think what was visible is that in spite of a lack of progress in Euro-regional governance and going beyond Interreg and not really committing yourself. I mean, we always talk about cooperation, but cooperation is many things. I think what is really more interesting is integration, and integration meaning like having serious cross-border public services, for example, or other forms of where you can see that actors from both sides actually go together and share resources and commit themselves to each other, give up control. Which has gone down to more or less zero now, I think, if I observe the Danish German, but also other European border regions. Whereas on the other hand, we can see that border region life has changed a lot in the Danish German case since Schengen, since the open borders, and that people more and more have become used to live in this cross-border space. And that we suddenly were aware of in March 2020, well, what's happening here? I mean, this is not possible anymore. What do we do? Like the border separating children, causing bureaucratic problems to commuters, and many other aspects of daily life, where suddenly the border mattered again.
Mm. But if we come then to the question, okay, we saw a crisis where probably some of our instruments of cross-border governance were not appropriate. Pascal Arimont, if you are now a member to the delegation to the Conference of the Future of Europe, I mean, if you were free to come with a list of things that could be changed in the treaty, what would be a top priority that would strengthen the position of cross-border regions?
First, I initiated a resolution in the parliament in order to change the Schengen Codex, who was in the core of were those border closures legal or appropriate, and we initiated that that resolution, and the parliament voted on the text that the Commission took over now, because the Commission will now, or has presented the first ideas for the changement or for the change of that Schengen Codex, and there for the first time border regions are mentioned. This is something new and something good, because if you want to close your borders, you have to assess whether closing borders has an impact on the daily life of citizens living in a border region. You have to explain that, so it makes it more difficult to do, and therefore this is a good thing. The second thing I would like to have in you do not have to change the treaties for that, but this would be that cross-border mechanism, that cross-border structure could choose for chosen projects the applicable law, and that they do not to have work with 2 or 3 different legal systems in order to create a project. That would make the life for cross-border people much more easier to invent projects, to implement projects. You're speaking about, or there is an analysis and assessment of the Commission that shows that we could decrease for 30 or 40% the costs of those projects if we have that, if we would have that cross-border mechanism. But if you want such a mechanism, that means that the national level have to to give competences towards those regions, at least for a certain time and in a described way. But there are so many national levels that do not really want to delegate power to the regions. This is the main problem in that discussion. But this mechanism could be a huge instrument in order to foster those projects, and we need those projects. We are discussing actually about a Fit for 55 package, where we have to collaborate and integrate energy systems cross-border, and how easy life could be if we would have those mechanisms that would allow project leaders to apply one single law in order to apply 3 different laws within one project. So this is something that I would like to see. And then, yeah, we have to, you know, a structure like that of the Euregio Maas-Rhein is something that grew since 30 years. You can't do those structures in one day or in 1 week or in 1 month. People have to know each other, and they have to build up that capacity to collaborate and to do things together. And therefore, we should help them. I was the rapporteur of Interreg. I tried to do the text in a way that that cooperation could be easier, could be feasible for those structures, and this is the way we have to do. You know, in the European Union, at about 150 million people live near a border. We had, for instance, to define what is a border region in the context of the COVID crisis, because we had to define exemptions of measures for border regions. And then we had to ask ourselves, what is a border region? Is it NUTS 2? Is it NUTS 3? Or is it only 10 kilometers? Is it 50 kilometers? We do not have such a definition yet. There are some definitions. We could have a definition, and we managed to have the NUTS 3 definition. But border region should be defined and should be recognized in texts like that Schengen Codex, really important. And we should introduce that border mechanism. I think that would be a great progress.
Mm-hmm. So in the first place, no big treaty changes are necessary to...
I think the treaty should be changed in, if we change it, if we manage to change the treaty, because we are far from that within that conference of on the future of Europe. I do not think that the future of cross-border structures or the cross-border regions is at stake, actually. I think that we will change the treaty in order to have those things that are actually in the focus and the spot that will be done. And cross-border regions live their own life a little bit, and we have to defend that. Yeah, I would, the first thing that I would like to see is that nations could not close borders as simple as they did 2 years ago.
Mm. And Martin, is there in the Border Region Study Association and all the people who deal with that, have you seen any ideas about how to strengthen also the situation of cross-border regions with treaty changes or major legal instruments?
I must not treaty changes, and I agree with you, Pascal. I do not think that the treaty changes are that important. I wouldn't even agree that a definition is important. I mean, of course, the definition is, and we have NUTS 3 because it's of Interreg intelligibility. I think I remember there was a discussion some years ago, Interreg 4 or so, to allow actually participation of partners outside of the Interreg region. In some of the projects, which I thought was basically a good idea. But if we take border studies, I would argue there is a stream or a faction of our colleagues who is looking at border regions in a functional perspective, meaning that we try to go away from territoriality and defining border regions as a territory, but looking more at flows, looking more at interactions, looking more at business connections, looking more at traffic, stakeholder interests. And I think there are some pretty good examples. We have a one in the Danish-German case, which is what we call the Jutland Corridor network, which is actually focused on the E47 motorway and includes actors all the way from Hamburg to northern Jutland, based on this idea that this is actually the main infrastructure axis. It's about 60% of Denmark's export to the EU that goes over this highway, and some more on the railway, and rather bundle actors to lobby for this specific corridor, and making politicians in Berlin and Copenhagen aware of that this is actually much more important than the Fehmarnbelt connection, which is the big thing now between Denmark and Germany. So having a rather flexible attitude towards borders, cross-border governance, but of course, and also what I think is important is the political will. It's something about reflection. I mean, it's fine that if we have the cross-border mechanism, and we have the HGC, which actually gives a lot of opportunities to engage in committing cooperation and cross-border services, whatever you like. But I think it's not really used very much as to its full potential. So it is, and there, of course, COVID plays a role, because suddenly actors realize, hey, I mean, some government decision might close everything again, and we cannot, and we have to be aware of. We have to actually fight for our cross-border opportunities. And looking at the opportunities means a lot. In the Danish-German case, I can name a lot of fantastic business opportunities that actually are successful because of the border, and because people who know how to navigate across the border have created very successful businesses, and in fact integrating the region.
Perhaps we have interesting also guests in the panel from DG Regio, Pascal Boymans and Ricardo, I think, and also Natalie, I think, is with us. May I ask, was there from DG Regio also a sort of paper document for the Conference of the Future of Europe with some elements? Or Pascal, do you know that? Was there an input?
Yes, good afternoon. No, unfortunately, there was not such a paper on the Conference of Europe. Of course, we have been following the debate with interest, and we also were participating in the meetings of the Cross-Border Alliance when they were formulating their positions, but not a separate paper from DG Regio on this. No. Okay. Of course, first of all, we were mainly also in the listening mode for the Conference on Europe, on the Future of Europe, to listen to the input from all the stakeholders. So. Yeah.
Pascal, because I was also wondering if you see the list of the 9 themes. I think there are 9 working groups. I wonder, is it European democracy, I think, is one theme? Is more or less the cross-border element also there? Where can I find that?
No, not really. I have to inform you that the DG Regio has submitted to Parliament and to the Council a good document, and we talked about it this morning, about how the border regions were a kind of laboratorium within the COVID crisis. And we had yesterday the discussion in Parliament about how to improve cross-border in the healthcare system, cross-border region in the healthcare, within healthcare issues. So we are constantly talking about how to improve situations. But within the Conference of the Future of Europe, I have to admit, this is so confused what's happening there, so vague and so unorganized, that I do not see actually where that conference will end with. Because we have spoken about everything and the opposite. And that makes it really difficult to know how or where it lands. I have to admit that I'm following those meetings since almost a year now, and I'm in the working group Health, and we did not yet speak about the Article 168. That is the core article of the Lisbon Treaty about what European Union is doing in the health issue. What are the competences? How could it be improved? How could it be changed? We did not yet spoke about that. So I do not know how the conference will be in the next weeks and months, but it seems to me that we will have somehow conclusions, but they are so general and so not really concrete that it will opens a new discussions how to make it more concrete, and that we should have somehow another tool in order to have the good conclusions in the end of that process. The process was interesting because there was a huge participation of people in that process. But in the end, we must separate the good from the bad ideas, or the concrete from the less concrete. And that exercise has not yet done, actually. And we are speaking about things that has been done or will never be done by the European level. But we have to concentrate on what the European level should do. And this is I think that conference is at risk, actually. And I hope that it will change its way of doing things and way of organizing things. Otherwise, it will be a failure at the end.
That's very surprising, because, of course, I thought if you talk about health, you talk about, is there the need for more harmonization if there is a next pandemic situation? What about the cooperation of hospitals with intensive care units? Do we have a European solidarity system of intensive care? But that was not
But if
discussed.
we want to have those ideas more concrete, we have to work on a text. We do not have a text on those issues. We do not work on text that we could amend or where we could put amendments in. We have some general conclusions of the citizen panel, but the main focus on health should be how to realize that we have those ideas. For instance, I think that in case of a pandemic, the European Union should have somehow a competence to define criteria, how to manage that crisis. And if we want such an idea within the text or within a legal base, we have to write it down. We did not do it until now. And I do not really see that it will be done, because we are discussing about the black and the white, but in between we should work on texts, but we do not have those texts yet, and therefore I'm trying to do that with colleagues, but it's highly difficult to have that. At 3 times I intervene in the discussion within the working group Health, and I explained that I would like now to discuss about the Article 168 and how to improve it. And that was it. No analysis sent to the panelists, no proposals of text sent to the panelists that we could work on. There is nothing, actually. There are the conclusions of 40 pages, but now we should act on somehow something that is more concrete. So this is the actual situation, and you can ask all the people that are actually a member of that conference, all those people tell you the same story.
It's interesting because, as I said, if you look into the agriculture policy, that is a community policy, of course, you can find also with respect to animal diseases, a lot of harmonization. So it's not that we do not do that type of harmonization. It is strange that we do that for animals, but not for human pandemic situations. So that is...
But it's rather based on the common market and
yes,
less on the health issue.
Of course, and you could say also the freedom of more or less why there was no problem bringing transport goods across the border. That was also the idea of the common market and the free movement of goods. That was apparently also very much stronger than the freedom of persons as such. That has also to do with the market. Perhaps to close then, I think we also have now reached more than 1 hour. Martin, perhaps a question also with respect to the debate in Denmark and Northern Germany. Is there a debate on the future of Europe? Because of course in Maastricht we had the citizens panel and that was of course then here in the news, but is that in the Danish news that there are people coming together talking about the future of Europe?
Yes, but I would say it's not a huge big thing involving lots of people. It's the people we always know who do these things. I mean, it's happening, but it's not. I mean, what did happen in Denmark, of course, was the Schengen Code, and where Denmark actually suggested or has proposed a more what they think more liberal, be saying, well, the government should decide themselves. They should no longer actually ask for the Commission when they want to establish so-called temporary border controls. So there it is. The Danish government is more on a rather restrictive side there, and saying, well, we do want these controls, even though the argument why they have it becomes more and more shady and less convincing, especially when looking at the actual effect of where there's no measurable effect on terrorism, crime, or whatsoever. So no, I mean, Denmark is this part. We always think Denmark is a Eurosceptic country, which is actually not true, because about 80% of the Danes approve of the EU. But on the other hand, it has never been a country that has been involved very much in the idealistic debates about European Union unity and so on. No? So it's a very, very pragmatic, sensible approach. Or a pragmatic approach that Danes can see that it's a good idea, especially what's happening now, that they can see as a small country, they have actually much more influence within the EU than standing outside.
Thanks a lot. So that is also a bit disappointing, I have to say, that there is, of course, not such a broad debate about the conference and the future of Europe. But I also have to say, if you do not live in Maastricht, perhaps in such a bubble with also the university, it will be not so easy to get information about the process and know exactly what is going on. Probably what we have learned is that the cross-border question is not really at the moment at the heart of the whole debate on the future of Europe. So you have really to search for that, and Pascal Arimont and also Martin Klatt are more of the opinion that probably it's not about treaty changes, it's more about finding the right instruments, strengthening instruments like the cross-border mechanism or EGTC, and look what type of instruments could we need in the future to improve that, or to have some clauses to Schengen and other existing elements in order to bring there also to strengthen the situation of the cross-border region. Then I would like to thank you for participating, and I hope it was a bit entertaining also for all our guests. Thank you very much also for the colleagues from DG Regio who joined us, and I hope you have a fine evening today, and see you next time with our next item. Yeah, thank you very much.